The dog escaped its leash, but the man refused to run. What happened next is astonishing. Mark Wahlberg's hands were still shaking when he pulled into the gravel car park of the rural animal shelter outside Byron Bay. The California sun had been replaced by the humid coastal air of northern New South Wales, and for the first time in months, he could breathe without feeling the weight of Hollywood pressing down on his chest. He'd come to Australia for a film shoot, but the production had wrapped early, leaving him with 3 unexpected weeks in a country he'd grown to love during previous visits. His wife Rhea had flown back to Los Angeles with the kids for school, but Mark had stayed behind, renting a weatherboard cottage near the beach, desperate for solitude. The shelter sat at the end of a dusty road lined with eucalyptus trees, their bark peeling in long strips that littered the ground like abandoned scrolls. Mark stepped out of his rental ute, wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. He hadn't planned to come here. He'd been driving aimlessly when he saw the handmade sign, Northern Rivers Animal Rescue. Something about it pulled him in. Maybe the memory of the German shepherd he'd had as a teenager in Dorchester, a dog named Duke, who'd been his only real friend during those rough years before he'd turned his life around. Inside, the shelter smelled of hay and antiseptic. A woman in her 60s with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes looked up from behind a cluttered desk. Her name tag read Margaret. "You right, love?" she asked, her accent thick with that distinctive northern Nest Dollars drawl. "Yeah, I'm just looking around," Mark said, keeping his voice low. He'd learned that in rural Australia, people either didn't recognize him or didn't care, and he preferred it that way. Margaret led him through a corridor lined with kennels, dogs of every size and breed pressed against the chain-link fencing, their eyes hopeful. Some barked frantically, others sat in resigned silence. Mark felt his chest tighten as they passed a one-eyed cattle dog, a 3-legged Jack Russell, a scarred staffy with grey around her muzzle. These were the forgotten ones, the dogs that had been through hell and back. Then he saw him. At the far end of the row, in the last kennel, sat a German shepherd unlike any Mark had ever seen. The dog was massive, easily 40 kilos, with a coat that seemed to absorb the dim fluorescent light. But it was his eyes that stopped Mark cold. They were amber, almost golden, and they held an intelligence that was almost human. The dog didn't bark or jump. He simply sat, watching Mark with an intensity that made the actor forget to breathe. "That's Rex," Margaret said softly, coming to stand beside him. "Found him on the side of the Pacific Highway about 6 months back. Someone had dumped him there, just left him tied to a fence post in the middle of nowhere. He'd been there so long his collar had grown into his neck. Took our vet 3 hours to remove it carefully enough that he didn't bleed out." Mark's jaw clenched. He'd seen cruelty before, grown up around it, but something about this particular story cut deep. "He doesn't trust people much," Margaret continued. "Can't blame him, really. He'll eat from our hands, lets us clean his kennel, but he won't let anyone touch him. Won't play, won't respond to commands, just sits there, watching. We've had a few people interested, but he scares them off pretty quick. Big dog like that, with trust issues. Most folks don't want the hassle." Mark crouched down, bringing himself to Rex's eye level. The dog's ears swiveled forward, but he didn't move. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, man and animal, both carrying scars that didn't show on the surface. "I'll take him," Mark said. Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "You sure? He's not exactly a beginner's dog. And you're only here temporarily, yeah? What happens when you leave?" "I'll figure it out," Mark said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "I'm not leaving him here." 2 hours later, after signing more paperwork than he had for his last film contract, Mark led Rex out of the shelter on a heavy-duty leash. The dog moved with cautious precision, his muscles coiled like springs beneath his coat. Margaret had warned him to keep the leash tight, not to expect too much too soon, to be patient. Rex hadn't been outside the shelter ground since he'd arrived. The moment they stepped past the gate, Rex froze. His entire body went rigid, and Mark felt the leash go taut in his hand. The dog's head swung from side to side, taking in the open space, the trees, the endless sky. His breathing became rapid, shallow pants that spoke of rising panic. "Easy, mate," Mark said quietly. "You're all right. Nobody's gonna hurt you." But Rex wasn't listening. His amber eyes had locked onto something in the distance, something Mark couldn't see. The dog's lips pulled back, revealing teeth that looked capable of crushing bone. A low growl rumbled from deep in his chest, a sound that made the hair on Mark's arms stand up. "Rex, hey, look at me," Mark said, trying to redirect the dog's attention. But Rex was somewhere else now, somewhere dark and dangerous, trapped in whatever hell his mind had created. Then it happened. The clip on the leash, which Mark had checked 3 times at the shelter, gave way with a metallic snap. Later, Margaret would apologize profusely, explaining that the equipment was old, that they should have replaced it months ago. But in that moment, all Mark knew was that Rex was free, and every instinct the dog had was screaming at him to run. Rex bolted, not towards freedom, not towards the bush, but directly at Mark. The dog's body was low to the ground, his movements predatory, and there was no mistaking his intent. This wasn't play. This wasn't exploration. This was an animal who'd been broken by humans and was determined never to be vulnerable again. Margaret's voice rang out from the shelter entrance. "Run! Get in your car! He'll tear you apart!" But Mark didn't run. He didn't move at all. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, and waited. Every muscle in Mark's body wanted to move. His brain screamed at him to run, to protect himself, to do anything but stand there like a target. But something deeper, something instinctive, told him that running would be the worst thing he could do. Rex wasn't attacking out of aggression. He was attacking out of terror. And terrified animals chase what runs from them. So Mark stood his ground. He didn't raise his arms defensively. He didn't shout. He didn't even flinch. He simply lowered his gaze slightly, making himself less threatening, and waited for Rex to reach him. The dog closed the distance in seconds, his powerful legs eating up the ground between them. Margaret's screaming faded into background noise. The world narrowed to just Mark and the animal hurtling towards him with enough force to knock a grown man flat. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat echoing in Mark's ears like a drum. Rex hit him at full speed, but not in the way Margaret had feared. The dog didn't leap for his throat or slam into his chest. Instead, Rex skidded to a halt less than a meter away, his claws scraping against the gravel as he fought for traction. His body was still coiled tight, every muscle tense, his teeth bared in a snarl that would have sent most people running for their lives. But his eyes told a different story. In those amber depths, Mark saw confusion, fear, and something else. Recognition, maybe, or hope. "You're all right," Mark said softly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "I'm not going anywhere, mate. I'm right here." Rex circled him slowly, his movements wary but less frantic. The dog's nose worked overtime, taking in Mark's scent, processing information that humans couldn't comprehend. Mark remained motionless, letting Rex investigate, letting the animal make all the decisions. He'd learned something on the streets of Dorchester all those years ago. You can't force trust. You can only create the conditions for it to grow. Minutes passed. Margaret had stopped shouting and now stood frozen at the shelter entrance, her hand covering her mouth. A younger staff member had appeared beside her, phone in hand, probably ready to call emergency services. But Mark barely noticed them. His entire focus was on Rex, on the slow dance of fear and possibility playing out in the dusty car park. Finally, Rex stopped circling. He sat down about 2 meters from Mark, his haunches hitting the ground with a soft thud, his mouth closed, the snarl fading into something more neutral. But his body remained tense, ready to bolt or fight at the slightest provocation. They stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. Man and dog locked in a silent conversation that needed no words. "I know what it's like," Mark said eventually, his voice so quiet he wasn't sure Rex could even hear him. "I know what it's like when people hurt you, when you can't trust anyone, when you're so angry and scared that you don't know which way is up anymore. I've been there, mate. Different circumstances, maybe, but I've been there." Rex's ears twitched, swiveling towards Mark's voice. The dog tilted his head slightly, that universal canine gesture of curiosity. "I was 15 when I nearly killed a man," Mark continued, the words coming easier than they had in years. He rarely talked about his past, about the assault that had landed him in prison, about the rage that had consumed him as a teenager. But here, in this dusty car park with this broken dog, it felt right to share it. Beat him so badly he lost an eye. I was high, angry, looking for someone to hurt because I was hurting. Spent 45 days in prison for it. Could have been my whole life. Could have ended up dead or doing life behind bars. But I got lucky. Someone gave me a second chance. Rex's posture had shifted almost imperceptibly. His shoulders weren't quite so high. His tail wasn't tucked quite so tightly against his body. "You deserve a second chance too," Mark said. "You didn't choose what happened to you. Neither did I, not really. But we get to choose what happens next. Both of us." Slowly, carefully, Mark lowered himself to the ground. He sat cross-legged in the gravel, making himself smaller, less intimidating. Rex watched every movement with those intelligent eyes, but he didn't back away. Mark reached into his pocket and pulled out a protein bar he'd stashed there earlier. He unwrapped it with deliberate movements, then broke off a piece and placed it on the ground between them. "Not much, but it's what I've got," he said. Rex didn't move towards the food immediately. He sat there, warring with instincts that told him to stay away, to protect himself, to never trust again. Mark could see the internal battle playing out in the tension of the dog's body, the flicker of his ears, the slight movements of his head as he looked between Mark and the food. Then, so slowly it was almost painful to watch, Rex crawled forward on his belly. It was a submissive posture, but not one of defeat. It was the posture of an animal, choosing to make himself vulnerable, choosing to try trust one more time, despite everything that had taught him not to. He reached the protein bar, sniffed it carefully, then took it gently between his teeth and retreated back to his spot. Mark felt something crack open in his chest, a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the Australian sun beating down on his back. He'd spent so much of his life building walls, protecting himself, staying hard so the world couldn't break him again. But sitting here, watching this damaged dog take the smallest step towards healing, those walls felt less important. "Good boy," Mark whispered. "That's it. You're doing great." They sat together in the car park as the sun climbed higher in the sky, as Margaret and the staff member gradually relaxed and went back inside, as the world continued spinning around them. Mark broke off more pieces of the protein bar, placing each one slightly closer to himself, and each time Rex crawled forward to claim it. The process was slow, painfully slow, but Mark had nowhere else to be. By the time the protein bar was gone, Rex was sitting close enough that Mark could see the old scar tissue around his neck where the collar had been embedded. Close enough to see the grey hairs mixed into the black and tan of his muzzle, suggesting the dog was older than Margaret had initially thought. Close enough to see the way Rex's eyes had softened, the amber warming into something less guarded. "We're going to figure this out together," Mark said. "I don't know how yet, and it's going to be hard, but I'm not giving up on you, I promise you that." The first week with Rex tested every ounce of patience Mark had cultivated over his years of sobriety and discipline. The weatherboard cottage he'd rented sat on 2 acres of property, far enough from neighbors that Rex's occasional barking wouldn't disturb anyone. Mark had converted the back sunroom into a space for the dog, laying down blankets and setting up food and water bowls, but Rex refused to enter the house. Instead, he'd claimed a spot under the veranda, curled into a tight ball. Watching Mark's every movement through the gaps in the wooden boards, Mark didn't push. He'd wake at 4 in the morning like he always did, say his prayers, then sit on the veranda steps with his coffee and simply exist in Rex's presence. He'd talk sometimes about nothing important, about the film he'd just wrapped, about his kids back in Los Angeles, about the waves he could hear crashing on the beach beyond the property line. Other times, he'd sit in silence, letting the sounds of the Australian bush fill the space between them. Kookaburras laughing in the gum trees, the rustle of possums in the roof, the distant drone of someone's ute on the main road. By the 3rd day, Rex had started eating the food Mark left out. By the 5th day, the dog was taking food directly from his hand, those massive jaws closing with surprising gentleness around the pieces of chicken or beef. By the 7th day, Rex followed Mark on his morning walk down to the beach, maintaining a careful distance of about 3 meters, never letting Mark out of his sight. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning. Mark had been doing his workout routine on the lawn, the same brutal regimen that had kept him in shape for decades. Push-ups, pull-ups on the tree branch he'd tested for weight capacity, burpees until his lungs burned. Rex had been lying in his usual spot under the veranda, but as Mark moved through his exercises, the dog had crept closer, watching with intense focus. Mark was in the middle of his final set of push-ups when he felt something cold and wet press against his shoulder. He froze mid-rep, his arms trembling from exertion. Rex had approached him, had actually made physical contact, pressing his nose against Mark's sweat-soaked shirt. The dog's breath was warm against his skin, and Mark could feel the slight tremble running through Rex's body, the courage it had taken for him to overcome his fear and reach out. "Hey, mate," Mark said softly, not moving. "That's it. I've got you." Rex stepped back immediately, but something had shifted. The distance between them had been crossed, and there was no going back. Over the next few days, those moments of contact became more frequent. A brush of fur against Mark's leg as they walked, Rex's head resting briefly on Mark's foot as they sat watching the sunset. Small gestures that meant everything. Mark had called Rhea to tell her about Rex, expecting her to be upset that he'd adopted a dog without discussing it with her first. But she'd laughed, that warm sound that had attracted him to her all those years ago. "Of course you did," she'd said. "You can't help yourself. You see something broken, and you have to fix it." "I'm not trying to fix him," Mark had protested. "I'm just giving him a chance." "That's what I said," she'd replied gently. "When are you bringing him home?" That question had haunted Mark for days. His time in Australia was running out. He had commitments back in Los Angeles, meetings scheduled, his kids, school events, the life he'd built over decades of hard work. But the thought of leaving Rex, of putting him back in that shelter or worse, trying to find him another home, made Mark physically ill. He'd been sitting on this problem when Margaret called him, her voice tight with worry. "Mark, I need to tell you something about Rex," she'd said. "I should have mentioned it before, but I didn't think it would matter since I figured you'd bring him back pretty quick like everyone else does." Mark's stomach had dropped. "What is it?" "Rex has a medical condition. Nothing life-threatening, but he needs medication twice a day for the rest of his life. Thyroid issue from the malnutrition and stress he went through. The medication's not expensive, but it's consistent, and if he doesn't get it, he'll get really sick. I'm so sorry I didn't tell you up front. I was just so desperate to see him get a chance." Mark had closed his eyes, doing the calculations in his head, the logistics of bringing a large dog with medical needs back to the United States, the quarantine requirements, the cost, the hassle. It would have been so easy to tell Margaret he couldn't do it, to apologize and walk away. No one would have blamed him. "Send me the details of his medication," Mark had said instead, "and the name of his vet. I'll need his medical records for the import paperwork." The silence on the other end of the line had stretched for so long, Mark thought the connection had dropped. "You're taking him back to America?" Margaret had finally asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Yeah," Mark had said, looking out at Rex, who was dozing in a patch of sunlight on the lawn. "He's coming home with me." The paperwork for importing Rex into the United States turned out to be a nightmare of bureaucratic red tape. Veterinary certificates, import permits, microchip documentation, blood tests for rabies titers that had to be processed by specific laboratories. Mark had hired a pet relocation specialist who'd walked him through each step, her patience infinite. As Mark asked the same questions multiple times, desperate to get everything right, Rex had to spend 30 days in Australia after his rabies vaccination before he could travel. Mark extended his stay, cancelling meetings and rearranging his schedule. He called in favours, had Zoom calls at odd hours to accommodate the time difference, worked from the cottage's dodgy internet connection. His management team thought he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had, but during those 30 days, something extraordinary happened. Rex transformed. Not completely, not into some perfectly trained social dog. He still flinched at sudden movements. He still refused to let strangers touch him, but with Mark, he blossomed. They'd run together on the beach at dawn, Rex's powerful body cutting through the sand with pure joy. They'd sit together on the veranda in the evenings, Rex's head resting on Mark's lap as Mark scratched behind his ears. The dog had even started sleeping inside, curled up on a massive cushion at the foot of Mark's bed. On their last morning in Australia, Mark took Rex to the beach one final time. The sun was just breaking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Rex ran into the surf, barking at the waves, his tail wagging so hard his whole back end moved with it. Mark stood at the water's edge, his feet sinking into the wet sand, and felt tears prick his eyes. "You saved me too, you know," he said to the dog, who was now attempting to dig a hole in the sand with furious enthusiasm. "I came here trying to find some peace, trying to remember who I am when I'm not being Mark Wahlberg the actor or Mark Wahlberg the producer. And you reminded me. You reminded me that the best parts of me, the parts I'm most proud of, are the parts that show up when someone needs help." The flight from Sydney to Los Angeles was 16 hours of controlled anxiety. Rex travelled in the climate-controlled cabin designated for larger animals, and despite the pet relocation specialist's assurances that everything would be fine, Mark spent the entire flight checking his phone obsessively for updates, imagining every worst-case scenario. He'd paid extra for a direct flight specifically to minimize Rex's stress, and the airline staff had been briefed extensively on the dog's medical needs and trauma history. When they finally landed at LAX, Mark bypassed the usual private terminal he used and went through the regular cargo area to collect Rex personally. The moment they opened the travel crate, Rex burst out and pressed himself against Mark's legs, trembling but unharmed. Mark dropped to his knees right there on the concrete floor of the cargo facility, wrapping his arms around the dog's neck, breathing in the familiar scent of him. "We made it, mate," he whispered. "Welcome home." Rhea had been skeptical about Rex, Mark knew. She'd supported the decision because she loved him, but he'd heard the concern in her voice during their phone calls. A traumatized dog with medical needs, in a house with 4 kids. It was a recipe for complications. But when Mark pulled into their driveway in their gated community, Rhea was waiting on the front steps, and the look on her face when she saw Rex was nothing but warmth. "He's bigger than I expected," she said, approaching slowly with her hand extended for Rex to sniff. The dog regarded her cautiously, then looked up at Mark as if asking permission. "It's all right," Mark said. "This is Rhea. She's family." Rex took a tentative step forward, sniffed Rhea's hand, then surprised them both by pressing his head against her palm. Rhea's eyes went wide, then soft, and Mark watched as his wife crouched down and began speaking to Rex in the same gentle tone she used with their youngest child. The kids had been another concern. Mark had sat them all down before bringing Rex home, explaining that this dog was different, that he needed space and patience, that they couldn't rush him or treat him like the neighborhood dogs they played with. His oldest had rolled his eyes, typical teenager, but when they met Rex, something magical happened. The dogs seemed to understand that the children were young, vulnerable. He was gentle with them in a way Mark hadn't expected, allowing them to be near him, but setting clear boundaries when he needed space. Within a week, Rex had appointed himself their guardian, following them from room to room, positioning himself between them and strangers who came to the house. Mark's youngest daughter, Ella, had taken to reading aloud to Rex in the evenings, curled up on the floor next to his cushion, and the dog would rest his head on her lap and listen as if he understood every word. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Rex still had triggers that sent him into panic mode. Loud noises, sudden movements, men in uniforms. Mark worked with a specialized trainer who had experience with rescue dogs, learning how to read Rex's body language, how to de-escalate situations before they spiraled. There were setbacks. A delivery driver who moved too quickly and got a warning growl. A neighbor who tried to pet Rex without asking and received a snap that didn't connect, but could have. Each incident required patience, adjustment, continued learning. Mark found himself thinking about Rex during business meetings, checking his phone for updates from Rhea or the dog walker they'd hired. He turned down evening events to be home for Rex's medication schedule. His friends joked that he'd become obsessed, but Mark didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt like he was doing something that mattered in a real, tangible way. 6 months after bringing Rex home, Mark was invited to speak at a fundraiser for animal rescue organizations. He normally declined these kinds of events, preferring to donate money quietly without the publicity. But this time, he said yes, and he brought Rex with him. The venue was an outdoor garden space in Santa Monica, strung with fairy lights as the sun set over the Pacific. Mark stood at the podium with Rex sitting calmly beside him, the dog's amber eyes scanning the crowd, but his body relaxed. It had taken weeks of training to get Rex comfortable in this kind of environment, but the dog had risen to the challenge. "I'm not going to talk about my career tonight," Mark began, his hand resting on Rex's head. "I'm going to talk about the day this dog escaped his leash and charged at me, and I made the choice not to run." He told them the whole story, the shelter outside Byron Bay, Rex's history of abuse and neglect, the moment in the car park when everything could have gone terribly wrong. He talked about the weeks of building trust, the decision to bring Rex home, the challenges and setbacks and small victories. As he spoke, he watched people in the audience wipe away tears, saw the way they leaned forward in their seats, completely absorbed. "The thing about rescue," Mark said, his voice rough with emotion, "is that it goes both ways. Everyone thinks I saved Rex, and maybe I did, but he saved me too. He reminded me that beneath all the noise and chaos of my life, beneath the fame and the money and the Hollywood bullshit, I'm still just a kid from Dorchester who knows what it's like to be counted out, to be judged by your worst moments instead of given a chance to show who you really are." Rex looked up at Mark then, and the trust in those amber eyes nearly undid him completely. "We all deserve second chances," Mark continued. "Every single one of us. Animals, people, it doesn't matter. We all deserve someone to stand their ground and refuse to run when we're at our worst. We all deserve someone to see past the snarling and the fear to the potential underneath." The fundraiser raised over $2 million that night. But more than that, it sparked something in Mark. He began quietly funding shelter programs, focusing on animals with medical needs or behavioral issues, the ones who usually got passed over. He didn't publicize it, didn't seek credit, just wrote the checks and let the organizations do their work. Rex became a fixture on set when Mark was filming, his presence so calming that other actors started bringing their dogs too. The dog, who'd once been too traumatized to trust anyone, now greeted crew members with gentle tail wags, accepting treats and scratches with dignity. He still had his moments, still needed his space, but he'd found his place in the world. On quiet mornings, Mark still woke at 4 and did his routine. But now Rex was there, running beside him, matching his pace step for step. They'd finish their workout and sit together as the sun came up. Man and dog, both scarred, both healing, both grateful for the moment when their paths had crossed. "Best decision I ever made," Mark would tell Rhea, watching Rex play with the kids in the backyard. "Which one?" she'd ask with a smile. "Adopting him or not running?" "Both," Mark would say. "Definitely both. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand still. Sometimes the strongest choice is to stay when every instinct tells you to go. And sometimes the thing you save ends up saving you right back." Mark had learned that lesson in a dusty car park in rural Australia, standing his ground while a traumatized dog charged at him, refusing to run because he understood, on some deep level, that running would mean losing something precious, something worth fighting for. Rex had taught him that love isn't always gentle. Sometimes it's fierce and frightening and requires more courage than you think you have, but it's always, always worth it. And as Mark sat on his back porch in the fading California light, Rex's head heavy on his lap, he knew he'd carry that lesson for the rest of his life.